Okay, so this lesson is on functions, relations, and graphs. And the graphs relate to the functions and relations. Now, we should know what functions are because we had a look at them. Now, relations will be very similar. It's essentially the same thing, but there's one thing that makes them different to the other one. So that's why we have a learning goal that says what makes a function and not a relation and how to graph them. Because a relation is like everything and a function is like a subset of that. Anyway, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is graph a function. Now, we sort of did this last time. We did a table of values and we said we have an input and we have an output. Here we have all these inputs and we're going to have to do an output. Now, be very careful how you do it. I'm going to show you how to do it. So I'm going to sub in f of -3. So I'm going to put negative, I'm going to put bracket -3 squared plus 3. Now the reason for that is that -3 squared is 9, but the negative at the front, this one, means that it's -9, and then we add 3, and we get -6, so that becomes that in there, okay? Now we're going to have to do this over and over again to put it in. So -2 will give us -4 plus 3, and that's -1. So, and then we've got -1 will give us -1 plus 3, and that is 2. And 0 will give us 3, because that will make it all 0. 1 will give us -1 plus 3, that's 2. 2 will give us -4 plus 3 is -1. And 3 will give us -9 plus 3, which is -6. Okay, so what we have here is our coordinates. Now this one you've known as your y graph, it still is, but because of the sake of what we're doing right now, I'm going to call this f of x, essentially your y graph, and this graph over here is your x graph. So let's graph it. So it's -3, -6, that's here, -2, -1, I think -1's there, -1, 2, that's there, and 0, 3 will be right there, 1 and 2 there, 2 and -1, that's there, and 3 and -6, it's there. And most of you should know that this is a parabola, okay? And it's a minus parabola because of this negative there. So I'm just going to draw it together. And this highlighted yellow bit, probably I should have used another colour, is our, I'll try to use a pen. So let's put them all together. This is how we graph a relation or a function, okay? Now you're going to find many ways to graph these things as we go further along in the course, but this is what the lesson's about at the moment. Okay, let's go to another thing, domain and range, okay? Now what you want to write is domain is x, all right, really important, and range is y, okay, is y. Really, really important. So when it talks about range, it's talking about y values, and when it talks about x, it's about, when it talks about domain, it's x values, okay? So domain and range. So if I look at this function, which we just did, f of x -2 plus 3, I've got the Desmos drawn one here. I apologise for those who don't like Desmos. And I can tell you that the domain, okay, so domain is x, so that's everything this way, okay, because that's the x value. And can you imagine that this is always getting wider that way, and this is always getting wider that way forever, okay? So I can say in this graph, the domain is all real values. Sorry about that. all real values of x, okay? Because this will eventually go to every value of x that there ever is, because it's getting wider and wider all the time, okay? So for this function, that's what the domain is. Now the range is a bit interesting. For the range, we're looking at the y values. I'm going to do them red. Yeah. We're looking at the y values. It stops at this number here, which is 3, okay? But then it continues forever down there. So we can say the range for this graph, for this function, is it's going to be less than or equal to 3, okay? So I think I wrote that right, where y is less than or equal to 3. So that tells you all the values of y it can be. It can be every value of y as long as it's less than or equal to 3, okay? Because it stops here at 3, but then it goes all the way down forever and ever and y. So that's explaining the y. So what is the domain? And I've spelt domain wrong. That's so bad. Domain is all x. And what is range? Range is all y. Okay? So it talks about that. Now, we can restrict domains and range. Like, for example, we can look at the domain between x is greater than, is less than, let's say, 1, and the domain is greater than -1. So what we're doing is that we're looking at all the values from 1, because that's 1 there. So we're just looking between here and here. So we're just looking at this zone, okay? Because we're restricting our domain, okay? Now what I wrote in purple and red down here, that is natural domain and natural range, okay? So whilst you do the exercise, hopefully you'll get a feel of what that means. Okay, let's move on. The main thing is domain is x and range is y, okay? Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is functions and relations, all right? I've got an example of 4 relations. All of them are relations, but only 2 are functions. The 2 functions are here and here, okay? Now, what makes them a function and not a relation is they pass the vertical line test. So, if I grab a line and I draw it anywhere on this graph, it only crosses the graph once, okay? See how it only crosses the graph once, there, at 1 point ever, okay? So anywhere we put our vertical line, it only crosses it once. Whilst this one to the left, what happens? It crosses twice. So therefore, it's not a relation. It's not a function, it's a relation, okay? So the ones at the top and the bottom, these are all functions because they pass the vertical line test, and this is just a relation because they fail the vertical line test. So the vertical line test, tells us if it is a function or not. It can only cross the function once for it to be a function. This one should be relation. Once for it to be a function. Okay? So that's functions and relations and how they relate to each other. No pun intended. Okay, that's the end of this lesson. Hopefully it makes sense. Peace out. If I can turn it on.